Hey everyone, how's everyone doing today? Welcome to our D&D stream again. And tonight we are going to be talking about vampires on DM Inspiration. And if you have just joined us, do you see this nice new hat that I'm wearing? So this is another Genshin Impact inspired hat, and I've got this hat now on stream thanks to Angela's Atelier, as always. She loves making cute hats. And if you are a Genshin player and you love gnome terrorists, if you love Klee, you will recognize this as one of the Dodoko hats. Why did the stream notification say it's not like I want you to join or anything? That's a good question. So there's this thing about us being very tsundere in the studio, right? So I guess that's exactly it. So yeah. So Dodoko hat, if you want to grab this, let us know. We'll be making arrangements with Angela's Atelier so that we'll stock these hats as well, and we'll make these available to anyone who might want to order them. If you want to get more Genshin hats, we have some slime hats on the way as well. Oh yes, the foam armor. Yeah. So if you haven't already noticed, I've actually just brought the Frostmourne up close as well, so you can see this. So this is Foammourne. So it's now placed right next to the armor in its place of honor here. And hopefully, I don't bump into it because I'm terribly clumsy, right? So yeah. So tonight we're gonna be talking all about vampires. Have any of you fought vampires in D&D before? Hey, you're not supposed to say that. You're not. No one's supposed to know that I bumped into it twice already. And let's not forget that I stubbed my toe against that the other day and tripped over it. But hey, Oh, wait a minute. All right. So yeah, vampires. Bump things in the night? No, things that go bump in the night, though. Vampires are absolutely things that go bump in the night. And they're not the kind of people that you want to meet on the street late at night. Uh, you might get dragged into an alleyway and they're just going to jump on you and they're going to start a grapple check and they're going to just drain your blood and that's going to be the end of you. Right? So, vampires. If you have just joined us, and I noticed that quite a few new people just jumped in right now as well. So we're all going to be talking about vampires tonight, and we are going to be sharing a little bit about how you can run vampires in your games for D&D, how you can play them as the dangerous undead predators that they are, rather than just, as creatures that are pushovers. We're also going to be talking a little bit more about how you can adapt your stories and feature vampires, especially if you have recently opened up packs from Innistrad, Crimson Vow, which is the new set from Magic the Gathering as well. If you have started checking out some cards from this set, you might notice some similarities later on when we show some images from Crimson Vow, which we're going to use as inspiration when we work on creating a story later on in today's session of DM Inspiration. So vampires in D&D are somewhat different from the vampires you see in Twilight. So they're certainly not going to be the type that sparkle in the sun. I guess they're going to kind of sparkle a little bit before they burst into flames, taking 20 radiant damage every turn before they turn to dust. But it's just going to be a little bit different. And definitely you want to see vampires being the best they can be at your table because after all, they are CR13 creatures. Shirtless vampires, I guess they're kind of popular. I know for a fact that some of the most popular vampires have actually been, you know, I guess popularized by games like Castlevania or in various anime and manga as well. Alucard from Helsing, being one of them as well. So it's really cool. And vampires have been featured so prominently in pop culture. But in D&D, they have actually come through so many iterations as well. And yeah, Jazian was painting a vampire, a hot, topless, shirtless vampire the other day on stream on Saturday, just a couple days back. And it looked like the mini turned out really, really well. And she's still currently working on that. So do keep up with our social media, and you'll see some pictures of that as and when we're ready to post them as well. So yeah, vampires. Where do I begin? So vampires, we all know, are CR13 creatures. They're really strong. They are one of the most iconic creatures in D&D. And there have been so many opportunities for game masters, for dungeon masters to use vampires in stories, right? I know I used a vampire as a random encounter when I was running Tomb of Annihilation during one of the segments in Chult, and it was really cool. The vampire surprised one of the party members was on watch, and that party member soon ended up having her blood drained from her by this nice, elegant gentleman that has somehow swam across a stagnant lake, come out of the water with his clothes, with his tunic, all wet and dripping, and kind of sheer looking, sticking to his skin. And she was really surprised because she didn't expect that nice person to be a vampire. And that's part of the charm of a vampire, or part of their charm, as it were, because they are quite capable of using that ability on characters. So I'm going to just grab a bit of a drink for a little bit. Tea is great. And yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about strategies, how you can introduce vampires into your story. How do you envision a vampire? When you think of the word vampire, what comes to mind? Well, some people might say that, the first thing they think of is maybe a certain sparkly vampire from Twilight. Flying bats, yeah, definitely. There was an excellent adaptation of Dracula as well, Dracula 2000. It's from quite a long time ago, but that was an excellent, depiction of a vampire on screen. In some cases, I would say vampires in pop culture as well. Underworld had some pretty cool vampires, though a lot of that was probably inspired, probably drawn from World of Darkness, from Vampire the Masquerade or Vampire the I can't remember what's the second edition, but yeah, so vampires from World of Darkness were fairly popular as well, and the way they were adapted. The Count from Sesame Street, I don't know. I guess he could be kind of a more comical depiction of a vampire, or Dracula, Dead and Loving It, had a very, very different sort of vampire as well. With, I think was it Leslie Nielsen. So that was more played for laughs, right? So that's a little different. But in D&D we look at vampires and we think, hey, this is a dangerous undead monster. This is a dangerous creature. It's something very sophisticated, something very intelligent, something with lots of powers at their disposal. And that's what it is, vampires. As compared to other, vampires have been depicted in so many cultures. So vampires are practically a staple in stories around the world. So other than the more Western Eurocentric kind of vampire that we're familiar with because of Bram Stoker's Dracula and other common depictions of the West, of course we also have breath-stealing Chinese vampires like Jiangshi. So these are also type of vampire. Workplaces around the world, yeah, I do. I mean, I definitely agree. You sometimes deal with, I guess you call them psychic vampires, energy vampires in in the workplace. Uh, Lots of them in like places like HR. I've encountered some of those before when I was so yeah, so but whatever it is, vampires are definitely something that you want to pull into your story and turn into a great villain. And there's no greater villain in D&D in terms of vampires than Strahd von Zarovich from Ravenloft, right? So that's one of the most iconic vampires in D&D. And we'll be definitely talking a little bit about Strahd von Zarovich later on, especially since we are going to be talking about an adaptation of, Curse of Strahd, so that it ties up with Innistrad and Crimson Vow, the storyline of Crimson Vow, which we'll be exploring. We're going to be crashing a wedding later on, the second part of today's program. So yeah. So why don't we all take a quick look at some of the abilities of the vampires first? Yeah. So I'm gonna just jump onto some of the images that I've created just for today. So I have some images set up, and you can see that in the background. So this is something from Crimson Vow, from Innistrad, from Magic the Gatherin's latest set. So you can see just a little bit. I'm just gonna show that for now. So you can see this is a vampire, a warrior vampire. He's called Audric the Bloodcursed. Yeah, and he's an iconic character in the story for Magic the Gathering for Innistrad. He's a paladin type character that was turned into a vampire bloodsucker, and that's a fairly common kind of story for vampires, right? You usually have this heroic character that somehow falls from grace, and that kind of happens in these stories, and they become these savage, bloodthirsty villains, these bloodthirsty fiends. And they retain much of their martial powers, much of their martial abilities, like their skill at arms or their ability to avoid danger. And these are all compounded by their abilities as vampires, because their senses become sharper, their abilities they become more dexterous, they become stronger, they become more durable because of the changes to their body. And some of these things are exemplified in the abilities that they have. So if you look at vampires as a stat book, and if you have the monster manual right now, feel free to flip to your chapter on vampires and you can read along after me. So vampires have pretty decent, armor class because they have natural armor. And as vampires are, largely humanoid in shape, that doesn't prevent them from wearing armor as well. Of course, in Adventurers League, we don't make changes to the stat blocks of monsters because that would affect the legality of the stat block. But if you were playing your home game, if you're playing with vampires in your own homebrew campaign, or if you were playing it in your own stories that you've created, there's nothing stopping you from arming your vampires with gear, right? And it's perfectly logical, it's perfectly in keeping, because after all, they might have been a warrior in the past, they might have been a paladin in the past, they might have been capable of wielding, a shield and wearing plate armor, for example. And that would make them really, really much tougher and more of a challenge. Of course, to represent the fact that they are also supernaturally durable, vampires have really high hit points. They are one of the tougher monsters that you'll face who are undead. Undead are generally not the toughest, but vampires are really tough. And of course, vampires are capable of restoring themselves, right? They have an ability to regenerate from damage. So that makes them really strong. And that usually happens at the start of their turns, so long as they have at least one hit point remaining and they aren't exposed to sunlight or running water, or if they have been affected by radiant damage. Yeah, so they can more or less heal themselves at the start of every turn from most injuries that they might face. And even better, because of their supernatural abilities, because of their supernatural defenses, they are resistant to damage. So they're not easily affected by necrotic magic. And most conventional weapons, like the pitchforks and tridents of peasants and fisher folk and other people that they might be preying upon, don't do quite as much harm to them. So that's really great. And that makes vampires so strong, because if a peasant is going to hit them with a spade, for example, that's probably going to leave a very shallow cut. And then soon after that, they're going to recover from that. They're going to regenerate from that. And yeah, so vampires are fairly durable. On top of that, they have regeneration and a good number of resistances. So that makes them a really, really tough fight for people who are not prepared for them. And that makes absolutely all sorts of sense. Vampires being, so strong and so powerful. Of course, they are also vampire spawn. Just show you another image. So let's say you meet a vampire spawn. So vampire spawn are created by vampires, draining the blood of one of their victims and reducing their maximum health to 0. Right? So they come, and if they're not properly taken care of, they come back as vampires. And this is one of the images from Crimson Vow as well, for the card called Wedding Security. And you'll know why there's wedding security, what security is involved, and why there's a wedding involved later on when we talk about the story of Crimson Vow and how we can adapt Curse of Strahd for that. But yeah, vampire spawn are the lower CR version of vampires, right? They are CR5, so they're not exactly too big of a challenge, and they are somewhat tough, somewhat durable. They have some of the defenses that a full-blooded vampire has, but they are, I suppose, a little more manageable for lower tier parties. And vampire spawn are just as deadly, though maybe not as sophisticated, not as powerful. They don't have the full complement of supernatural abilities to bear just yet. I'm going to start actually by talking a little bit about vampire spawn before we move on to talking about vampires and strategies involving vampires. So looking at the vampire spawn appear simply because they are the victims of vampires. They've been drained by vampires, and they rise as the servants of these full-blooded vampires. And if you look at the stat block, if you follow along and you check out the stat block in the monster manual, you can tell that vampire spawn have 82 hit points. And that's a fairly high amount of hit points for a CR5 creature, for a creature that's best dealt with by adventurers that are in the vicinity of maybe levels 4 to 5 on average. So they're not exactly super tough, super powerful, but they still pose a reasonable challenge. Just like their vampire forebears, just like their, I guess you call them sires, to use vampire parlance. They can regenerate, and they have the ability to use spider climb as well. So they can move over all sorts of difficult terrain, scotch tape themselves to ceilings, and so on and so forth. And they're great. Okay, so what's this about? My party and I have found a very niche dice curse after a session with 3 charisma checks. And so on and so forth. And hello, so good to have you with us. Nat ones, I don't think that's a great thing, and you definitely don't want to roll nat ones when you're facing vampires. That's for sure. Well, thanks for joining us. Good to have you. Good to have you with us tonight. And you're just in time to hear us, chat about vampire spawn. The thing about vampire spawn is that you can face lots and lots of them all at once, especially if it's late at night. Imagine the whole horde of vampire spawn jumping your party right outside the gates of a city. Now that's gonna be terrifying. And that actually happened at one of the runs of our Curse of Strahd adventures. I recently ran a series of sessions for the hardcover Curse of Strahd, and the party found themselves outside the gates of this town called Kresk. It's a fortress town. And it just so happened that they arrived at Kresk when night had just fallen. The mist was rolling in from the forest. And all the vampire spawn started popping out of the forest, rushing for the party. And they tore the barbarian, who was raging, mind you, apart in one round. And it was brilliant. It was such a strong, such a an exciting and such a cinematic scene. The vampire went down after being, attacked by all sorts of magic spells. When the cleric pulled out a holy symbol and channeled his light magic, the vampire spawn scattered, but not before the barbarian was torn to shreds. So that was a powerful scene from the table. It shows how scary vampire spawn can be, even though the party was almost level 10 at that point in time. So getting mobbed by vampire spawn, not so great. At low levels, vampire spawn are pretty excellent. They're not the brightest. Their intelligence isn't super high. It's maybe average, above average, and with an intelligence score of 11, wisdom score of 10, and a charisma score of maybe 12, which kind of puts them slightly above the average optimized adventurer. But vampire spawn nonetheless are excellent as low-level villain. If you're playing maybe a tier 1 adventure, having a vampire spawn stalk your party in the woods, or stalk your party in a cavern complex, or in the catacombs under a city, they'll make a very scary villain, make a very scary encounter. Imagine the vampire spawn with its spider climb ability, and not being subjected to things like sunlight because they're underground, or deep in the forest where the sun doesn't shine because the sun just simply cannot go through the canopy of the forest. And having this vampire spawn chasing after your party, picking out one character at a time, grabbing them, pulling them up into the branches, biting them and tossing them aside. Now that's going to be a super awesome encounter. It's going to be really fun for you to run as a DM, and also really fun for for your players. Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to just read through that a little bit. There's a lot of text right there. It's intimidate. I'd say that really looks like quite a bit of a tricky situation right there. Intimidate typically isn't the best skill to use when you're dealing with NPCs, and you tend to end up with a situation that's usually worse than what it is most of the time when intimidate is concerned. And nonetheless, I think that's actually a social encounter that can have many layers of complication. And sometimes the dice don't really matter. So if you roleplay well enough, definitely your DM is gonna work with you to make sure that the scene continues and carries on, and everyone has a good experience. So it's really about how you talk to the NPCs. Conquering presence, yeah. Well, if you think about it, conquering presence it's definitely a pretty good ability to have on a paladin. So I do notice quite a few more people have just jumped in as well. So we were just chatting a little bit about vampires and vampire spawn, and talking about how mobbing players with vampire spawns is not so fun. Though it does make for a rather interesting kind of encounter, even at higher levels, because vampire spawn are not that tough. You can probably lob a few spells at them, and that's gonna just wipe them out. But if you have maybe 20 vampire spawn coming at your party from different directions, it's gonna force you to make tough decisions, right? So that's gonna require you to decide on your angle of attack, how to focus your fire, stuff like that. So that's gonna be challenging for players, and that's part of the fun of dealing with multiple vampires of any sort. At low levels, one vampire spawn could probably grab someone, pull them away from the group into some dank, nasty, dark alleyway somewhere, and they're gonna start either using that person as a blood bag or use that to threaten the rest of the party members. And that's perfectly acceptable because vampire spawn have an ability that includes an attempt to grapple. So if you look at that, if you look at vampire spawn, their claw attack, if you land a claw attack, you can grapple the target instead of dealing damage. And the DC to escape from the grapple is 13, which is a fairly reasonable amount, I would say. Most average adventurers at low levels will probably be able to wriggle their way out with some difficulty, maybe 50% of the time. So that's not the worst. And part of the fun as well is that the vampire has two attacks. So they can make a claw attack followed by a bite attack. And typically, if you claw and you grab someone and you grapple the target, you can bite them next, and you can reduce your maximum hit points by an amount equal to the necrotic damage you roll on the bite. So it's not too bad. It's 2d6, averages around 7, top end of 12. So you could probably bite maybe a wizard that dumped their con, right? So if a wizard dumped their constitution score and they had like a -1 modifier to their constitution score, that's not really so great. They're also kind of going to be weak because wizards tend to dump strength as well. So they're a prime target to grapple. So pop out behind one of them, grab them because they're always in the back line, being wizards and all, drag them off into the alleyway, start biting them, and soon to become, very, very dead wizards, right? And these tend to be the people that wield all the powerful magic, right? They have all the cards to deal with vampires. And as a vampire spawn, you probably want to get rid of them first because you're weak against magic. And without magic users, without spellcasters that can enchant weapons or deal fire damage or deal, radiant damage or whatever damage, a vampire is probably going to have a much easier time dealing with the average rank and file fighter or the barbarian, because they're going to be relying on weapons, and that's going to make all the difference in the fight. And that's vampire spawn for you in a nutshell. So vampire spawn, generally not the greatest. At low levels, they're great as a single target, as a single creature, picking away at a party, or perhaps if they were slightly more dangerous, slightly more influential, slightly more powerful, perhaps it could be a local villain of some sort in a small hamlet that's terrorized by vampires. So that could kind of work. So there are lots of ways you can tell the story for that. I see Phantom has joined us as well. So just in time, and today, because we are talking about Curse of Strahd after all, and Phantom, it's a great DM for Curse of Strahd. I've had the honor of playing at his table, and I think that we're going to have a great discussion later because as long as he's around. So good to have you with us tonight. So vampires, by comparison, are slightly more, I would say, challenging to run and to play as well. Yeah, because rather than just a rank and file, rather than just a typical vampire spawn who doesn't have a whole lot of tools at their disposal, a vampire has various other abilities. For example, the vampire is quite capable of changing their form. They can polymorph themselves. They can become bats or clouds of mist, or they can take on any other forms, as long as they have maybe some magic at their disposal that they can use, right? So they're actually quite powerful in that sense because the ability this gives them the ability to fly while they are in bat form, and in the mist form they are very tough to pin down, and they can move into incredibly tiny spaces. So that's really strong. And let's not forget the fact that vampires, full-blooded ones, have legendary resistance as well. So magic's gonna have a harder time sticking to them. So if your characters are spellcasters, if your characters are capable of using magic to somehow restrain or control the vampire, they can simply choose to pass. So that's great. And that really makes a big difference, especially since vampires are also quite proficient in all the saves that most typical magic users rely on to control or trap someone. So vampires have, proficiency in dexterity saves, wisdom saves, and charisma saves as well. So that takes care of things like banish. That takes care of things like hold monster. That takes care of most fireballs as well. So that's really good. That's really cool. And I see we've got a sub for Pyroton. So yay! Everyone's gifting subs to everyone. All right, and yeah. So what else do vampires have that their spawn do not? Well, vampires get charm, and the charm is a fairly reasonable, powerful ability. Considering the fact that it's a DC 17 on a wisdom, and the charm is typically used to target characters that are not so proficient in wisdom saves. You typically want to go for the rogue, or you want to go for the barbarian that doubt wisdom, or the fighter perhaps, because these are not their strong suits, right? And if they are charmed, and they are meat stacks, as it were, it means that they're going to be getting in the way of their own allies. It's going to be harder for them to be effective because they're not pinning down the vampire, but they're pinning down their friends. And it's pretty cool. Children of the Night as well is a vampire ability that I think I really enjoy. I think it's really great. With a full-blooded vampire summoning hordes of wolves and bats and swarms and such. It's brilliant. Especially if you have wolves, because wolves have the ability to push people down. Best use of blasting Rhythm of the Night. I don't know. Personally, I prefer Symphony of the Night. But then again, I'm a bit of a weeb and I love Castlevania way too much. Right? So yeah. 3d6 wolves on average get maybe 9 to 10 wolves or thereabouts. So that's really cool. And these wolves are going to be great for granting advantage. They're going to knock people down. And it takes a little bit of time for you to conjure them. It takes about one, maybe 2 to 3 rounds, sometimes 4, because you roll d4 for that. But when they arrive and they're under your vampire's command, they're great for dealing with mooks. Sicking the wolves on a party as they're riding through a forest, somewhat oblivious to their surroundings, having the wolves pop out of the bushes, pop out of the trees, jumping onto their horses. It's great. It's a great way to slow them down, to knock them down, and then you have the vampire swoop in and start attacking the party. And that is incredibly fun. Vampires have great legendary actions as well. They have 3 legendary actions, and they can use these fairly effectively. Because these actions are all relatively helpful because some of them grant mobility. Like the vampire can use one of the actions to move without provoking any opportunity attacks. And that's great. It stops your vampire from being surrounded. You can use the ability to make an unarmed strike as well. And of course, the unarmed strike for a vampire is treated the same way as its regular unarmed strike. So you can use the legendary action unarmed strike to hit someone and grapple them. And then subsequently, you can use your legendary action to take the bite attack. And of course, this costs 2 actions, but it's still great, right? And this means you grab a meat bag as you're moving around and give them the suck. They lose health, your vampire gains health back. Yeah, beat them up and drag them away and leave your wolves or your vampire spawn to tie down the rest of the party while you pick them off and systematically drain their lives by biting them consistently, one adventure at a time. Yeah, definitely. It's like going. It's kind of like a drive-by, ride-by kind of thing, or a drive-through, except you're the one stopping them and taking them away as food. So that's great. That's excellent. Now the next thing I guess that will make vampires even better, because vampires on their own they're incapable of using magic. They have some supernatural powers, I would say. But now, what about vampires with magical abilities? Vampire spellcasters. So one of the most iconic vampire spellcasters, I would say, is probably Stradvan Zarovich himself, right? So Stradvan Zarovich himself in his stat block, he has some spells. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we jump into that portion of the show. But vampire spellcasters are also featured in the monster manual, and it's an alternate stat block for vampires, and it has a much greater CR than a typical vampire. A typical vampire is somewhat of a challenge, or so Wizards of the Coast says, for a party of average level 13 adventurers. While a vampire spellcaster who is capable of casting spells as if they were a 9th level wizard is CR 15. So let's take a quick look at that as well. So if you have your monster manual, like I said, please follow along, flip to the page of the vampire spellcaster, and we can discuss. Yeah, we can talk about how we might be able to tune the vampire spellcaster to be even more interesting. So other than what we discussed just now about how you can arm your vampire spawn and your vampires by letting them wear armor and wield weapons, vampire spellcasters add another layer, another dimension to the game. Because if they are capable of preparing spells, just as it says in the vampire spellcaster stat block, they have the following wizard spells prepared. This assumes that they are capable of preparing spells like a wizard. You can change out spells on your spell list with something thematically appropriate. Of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the spells on their default list first, and then we'll talk a little bit about, viable additions or viable changes. So that's one of the things that we'll probably be discussing. So vampire spellcasters, just like any typical vampire, the only difference is that they have so much magic that they can use. And one of the best spells they have on the default spell list is, of course, Greater Invisibility. Imagine a vampire that's also invisible, stalking you, attacking you with advantage, you having disadvantage to attack them, and sometimes quite possibly not being able to see them because you don't have magic that will allow you to see invisible creatures. Now that is going to be a terror to behold. And with such magic at their disposal, the vampire becomes much, much scarier than what it originally was. Of course, other spells on their spell list, spells like Fog Cloud as well. Fog Cloud is a great way for them to mess up the battlefield, to create obscurement. And don't forget that vampires have the ability to turn to mist. So using the Fog Cloud to create a misty area, and then turning to mist to either run away, to flee, or to hide themselves is a great strategy as well for a vampire spellcaster. They have access to the sleep spell as well, but the sleep spell is not so great, especially at the level when adventurers are kind of facing vampire spellcasters already, because sleep is generally not a great spell for that. Most adventurers at the level where you're fighting a vampire spellcaster would probably have so many hit points that the sleep spell becomes redundant. Unless, of course, you have enough mooks, you have enough, minions and enough summoned creatures to kind of mob them and whittle away at their hit points until they have that's nothing left. And then maybe a sleep spell will just knock all of them out at once. What kind of spells do you think would be great for a vampire? Other than spells like, fog cloud or greater invisibility, what do you think? I would say at third level, non-detection on the default spell list seems to be pretty good as well, and it's kind of a great way for them to foil detection magic. It's a great way for them to avoid having their undead nature and their supernatural abilities kind of sussed out by people using detection spells, divination spells. So non-detection is kind of cool for them. And Dominate Person, even though it's a lot less subtle, Dominate Person remains one of the most effective spells at 5th level in your default list that you can use. And if you encounter a character who wields maybe a Staff of Power, and you can kind of get a jump on them and hit them with a Dominate Person, what do you think happens? You can command them to break their staff and blow themselves and their friends up. But don't do that. Don't do that too often. That's a bit of I guess that's a bit mean, I would say. But perfectly in keeping with a vampire spellcaster if the vampire spellcaster has been keeping tabs on the party. So yeah. Other spells you might want to consider. Slow is a pretty good spell for a vampire spellcaster to use on players. Slow cuts the action economy of the party down to a crawl, and I'm not kidding. It really hurts them, especially if you get rid of their reactions, you get rid of their extra attacks. You make them so much more vulnerable to magic. Slow is generally a great spell. So that's something to explore in the vampire spellcaster as well. You probably don't want to take too many attack spells, but you could probably benefit from maybe Fireball as well. So again, a 3rd level spell, pretty good alternative to things like Animate Dead, which has no practical uses except outside of combat, or Bestow Curse, which is difficult to stick and not exactly the best unless you upcast it. So these are great alternatives for the 3rd level spells that a vampire spellcaster might have. If you have enough minions, you may want to consider using your 2nd level slot for, I don't know, Dragon's Breath. Dragon's Breath is probably cool on a vampire spawn that's, one of your minions, right? You can cast it on your minion and have them be able to breathe a gouge of fire or a gouge of acid or something at your enemies. So it's going to be a bit of a surprise for the characters because they don't expect that kind of damage or that kind of attack to come from a vampire spawn. So that's a way to shake things up a little bit. For level 5, Wall of Force. Wall of Force is also kind of cool and kind of great for a vampire spellcaster if you can pull that off. Because why? You have the mobility, you have the movement skills to get away from your own Wall of Force, but the players may not. And they may not even be able to see the walls because they are simply invisible, right? So wall up the party using a Wall of Force, zigzagging around to separate them into different compartments, and then you can munch on them at your leisure. because they're all segregated from their friends, they're all separated. They don't have exactly an easy way to get to each other unless they're capable of casting teleportation magic or some form of movement ability. Like maybe unless you can fly around. Yeah, you can kind of make it like a bento box. So you're absolutely right there. So you can have snack size gnome ranger for a snack, and then you go for the halfling rogue, and then maybe you go for the elven bard or something, and then you can work your way up from like the sides to the main course, and then you go for the dessert. So that's kind of cool. So vampire spellcasters are great that way. You combine the best abilities of a vampire together with the best sorts of magic that I guess you can get your hands on, right? So that's really fun. And one other thing as well, a lot of people assume that vampires are in trouble when you expose them to sunlight. But if you are a vampire spellcaster, you can protect yourself from sunlight by using magic that can darken the area. Like a darkness spell will prevent you from being affected too badly by conventional, normal, ordinary sunlight. It's not going to protect you from a magic item or a magic spell that creates sunlight, but it's going to be helpful when you're trying to avoid getting baked by the sun on a regular day, right? So that's pretty helpful. Unfortunately, some of these spells that are really good that create absolute blackness or creates a black void or something devoid of sunlight, those are more warlock spells. It's gonna be a little tough for you to get your hands on Hunger of Hadar, for example. But if you were able to do that, if you had a vampire spellcaster that had access to warlock spells, spells or warlock uh, magic, or maybe something even more powerful than that, or if you were playing a vampire bard spellcaster, and this is more again, for home games, that might be great. That might work. You'll be able to get access to more magic. And that's going to make all the difference when you're playing your vampire as a film. Now let's talk a little bit, I guess, about what kind of stories would you write with a vampire as a villain? For me, I would say vampires are kind of great as maybe a local lord, just like in Innistrad. He's a local lord, and people are deathly afraid of him. And this whole vampire as a local nobility, local lord kind of thing also carries into Innistrad as well, right? Where the vampires govern, the Stancia. And that's one of the places that you will be visiting if you ever decide to play a game that's kind of based off Crimson Vow, which is a new MTG set, right? Because that's where the Vampire Wedding comes in. Vampires are also kind of great as a predator, harming a village. Mysterious deaths, people being drained of blood, or people just disappearing into the wilderness. Could be the work of a vampire spawn. That's entirely possible. So that makes a good low-level story. And like I said, vampire spawn are great for low-level adventures to deal with. So that's not too bad. That's something to consider as well. It's a good opportunity for some storytelling right there. How about for something a little bit more high profile, that maybe higher tiers of play? Maybe there's a I guess a kingdom of vampires, and this kingdom of vampires just so happens to threaten the rest of the world for some reason or the other, right? So that's a very common kind of tropey kind of fantasy story kind of thing. and the players could be, you know, a whole bunch of vampire hunters, and they're going from town to town, freeing the towns from the grips of vampires. They're vampire overlords, or the vampires that invaded this place. And you see this kind of story in a lot of anime as well. Like if you followed, if you followed Demon Slayer, so that's a very common kind of concept for that as well, right? So hunters and vampires. So that's a very typical kind of story where vampires are involved. And now that we've talked a little bit about that, I guess we could start maybe exploring a little bit about how vampires might fit, especially into a story set in Innistrad, because after all, Innistrad is a gothic plane. It's a very dark, very twisted, very scary plane in the world of Magic the Gathering. So it's one of the planes where vampires, zombies, werewolves, and other such creatures populate the plane, right? And humans are kind of like the prey. They're like the really weak victims of all these creatures of the night. So if you were ever to write a story about that, uh, I would say if you were ever to play a human or humanoid character, like maybe an adventuring sort, you'll probably be struggling constantly against these supernatural creatures. Or if you were playing in Adventurous League and you were playing in Forgotten Realms, which is the default, Adventurous League setting, you might want to consider building a character that maybe hunts down supernatural creatures. There might be a backstory tied to that. Maybe your hometown was ravaged by vampires. Maybe someone in your up your family tree, just like among the Belmont clan in Castlevania. Maybe someone and the vampires are diametrically opposed to each other. You have this whole vendetta going through the centuries, and it just so happens that you have inherited the abilities of being a vampire slayer, right? So that could be interesting to talk about. That could be a good premise for a story as well, and coming up with some concepts for that. But typically, as a game master, as a DM, if you are going to be dealing with players who are really well armed and well equipped to deal with your vampires, how do you handle that? Now, if your party of adventurers comes into your game with, I don't know, maybe five sunblades, so everyone's got a shiny beacon of light in their hands. They're all wielding lightsabers. How do you deal with them? And one of the easiest answers for that is use non-vampire creatures. Right? So you could definitely have your vampires summon their children in the night, send their wolves after the players, find ways to divest them of their sunblades. So that could be one way. Or if you had a vampire spellcaster, use some magic to take care of them. And one of the best ways to do that is to yeet them outside the window, throw them somewhere far away, or remove them to different places of your lair, perhaps, where the rest of your minions who are not allergic to sunlight can deal with them. But yeah, enough about that. Enough about that for now. If you have any specific questions about vampire encounters or how you can more effectively run those vampires, feel free to share, feel free to ask. Happy to chat about it. In the meantime, I'm going to jump a little bit into talking about Innistrad because that's really been on my mind for the past week or so, ever since we got our box of Crimson Vow and I started tearing those packs apart and seeing all the cool vampires featured in the art. So what's Crimson Vow about? So Crimson Vow is essentially about a wedding, vampire wedding, in fact. So one of the greatest vampire leaders in the plane of Innistrad has kidnapped another ancient vampire from a different bloodline, and they are going to be joined in unholy matrimony. They're going to be married, and that's going to create the biggest, most dangerous vampire clan in the history of this plane. And they're going to sweep across the plane, and that's going to be the end for all the humans and all the other creatures that call it the struggle, right? Because vampires are apex predators. And if all the power is invested in the vampire clan, this is going to make the balance of this world really, topple. Things are going to change. The balance of power is going to shift to the vampires, and all hope will be lost. Especially since in Midnight Hunt, it was discovered that night was growing longer and the days were growing shorter. And it doesn't help that one of the MacGuffins of the story, the Moonsilver Key, has fallen into the hands of the vampires as well. So bad stuff. And in the case of D&D, in the case of us creating a story, yeah, I think it's been blocked off by my window here. So let me just, maybe I'll just turn that off. There you go. So that's a wedding invitation right there. And where things are concerned, this wedding is going to be the biggest thing that happens on Innistrad, and of course, some planeswalkers, basically some characters in the Magic Gathering universe, are going to try to crash the wedding. One of them being Sorin Markov, the grandson of said ancient vampire patron that got kidnapped. So if we want to talk about using, Curse of Strahd, for example, if we want to talk about using Curse of Strahd in this storyline, if we want to use that hardcover book, we can use Chapter 4, which is the castle, and we can use some of the stat blocks in the hardcover as well, and we can adapt that for the storyline for Innistrad. And one of the biggest things we can explore for this is for Edgar, to represent Edgar Markov, who is the Markov patriarch. We can use Strahd Vazarovich, and it's kind of perfect. It fits pretty well into the story as well, because Edgar Markov is proficient in some elements of magic. He's mastered some degree of alchemy and other things like that. And Strahd is a vampire spellcaster. Strahd uses the somewhat modified vampire spellcaster stat block. So that's something we can definitely try to utilize in our adaptation. And of course, the person that Edgar Markov is going to get married to is Olivia Voldaren. And in Adventurous League, there was a particular story called The Dark Lord. It's part of the Season 4 storyline, 0414, where there was a character called Esme Amarantha, and this character is also a spellcaster, a very powerful magic user. And she would be perfect for Olivia Voldaren. Of course, if you were going to keep this AL legal with the new changes in Season 11, it's going to be a little tough to use a stat block from one of the AL Avengers. So rather than using that, we're just going to make her a vampire spellcaster as well. So that's entirely possible if you want to keep it kind of AL legal and make her a thematically appropriate addition to the encounter for this, for this particular adaptation that uses Chapter 4 of the Curse of Strahd hardcover. Oh, hey, I see Raziel has just joined us. Hey there. Right. So that's who we have here. We have Edgar and Olivia. This is Olivia Voldaren. and you can definitely utilize them using those stat blocks. That's going to kind of work a good representation of what's possible for this story. And of course, the Voldaren Estate Instancia. This is where the wedding is going to take place. And look at the silhouette of that Voldaren Estate. Look at the silhouette. It totally looks like Castle Ravenloft or Castlevania, Dracula's castle, right? It's all those Gothic spires, all the bats flying around, all the tall towers stacked upon each other. So this is really pretty. It's really suitable as a setting. So it kind of fits nicely into the story. So Castle Ravenloft Chapter 4 seems to be the perfect place for all these things to take place. And of course, most importantly, perhaps, we have the adventurers. So the adventurers are gonna be the ones that are jumping into this particular adaptation of Castle Ravenloft. They're gonna be the ones who are breaking in, crashing the wedding, disrupting the plans of the vampires. Look at that. Look at these somewhat desperate adventurers yelling and shouting and brandishing their swords and their axes. Totally tier 1 adventurers, I swear. But perhaps they'll survive. Who knows? So yeah. So why Castle Ravenloft? Why did I choose to use this particular book and this particular chapter to represent, this storyline? I felt that it was kind of thematically appropriate for that because Curse of Strahd, in and of itself, it's a very powerful story. It's a great story with a vampire antagonist. It hits all the right notes. It has the same kind of gothic appeal, same kind of gothic feel as the Plane of Innistrad. And I said, hey, after opening my packs on Wednesday last week, had a bit of a think about it. I felt that it was gonna be just a good fit, right? With so many vampires around, you could use all the areas in the castle. You had your audience chambers. You had your grand stairways. You had your dungeons. You had your hallways filled with all sorts of creatures and teleportation traps and mysterious things, and that really made it so appropriate for Innistrad, for this Voldaren Estate Essentia. So if you want to crush a wedding, there's no better place. You can just adapt that rather than creating your own scenario, rather than creating your own content. Why not use this chapter of the Curse of Strahd hardcover that's already been prepared? All the rooms, all the notes, everything is there. Just adapt it, modify it, and there you go. You have your own self-contained mini adventure where your players are adventurers trying to prevent this union between Edgar Markov and Olivia Voldaren, right? So they're here to just crash the wedding. And how are they going to crush the wedding? That's an interesting thing because there are going to be lots of monsters, lots of creatures in the way that will prevent our adventurers from succeeding. For example, if you take a look at this particular artwork here, this is actually from one of the cards that I really like from the set. It's called Henrika Infernal Seer, and she's a great example of one of the possible brides of Strahd, similar to one of the brides of Strahd in hardcover. So we can have quite a few of these characters involved in the story. So she would make a good example of Ludmilla, and you can use a vampire stat block for that. I think that would be a great standard vampire stat block. or if you want to give her a bit of magic, like what we used to do in our Attack on Castle Ravenloft, which we run as a fully AL legal activity for the local Singapore Adventures League community. So Phantom and Jazian and I and Piriton, we all ran some permutation of this before. And most recently, we actually ran a three-table Attack on Castle Ravenloft on during Halloween to help raise funds to pay for the DDAL SG Singapore server, right? And it's a great way for players to experience Castle Ravenloft. Just Chapter 4, you're there to mount an attack on the castle. And that's very much similar to what you might expect to see, what you might expect to do if you are crashing a wedding for, Edgar and Olivia. So it's kind of same, I guess, same, but different in that sense. So that's part of the fun. And what else? What else? Let's take a look. So this is another card from the set. Again, look at the amazing artwork, amazing renditions of vampires. Crimson Vow is super good where it comes to artwork. I really love it. So Blood Crazed Socialite. So this could represent Anastasia, which is another one of the brides as well. And again, Vampire Stat Block. And if you want to make it a little bit different, make her a vampire spellcaster, give her some degree of magic, just like what we did during our Attack on Castle Ravenloft runs. Yeah. Or this one, how about this? Totally a Volanta, if I don't say so myself. Gluttonous Guest. These are some of the alternate artworks, and it's simply brilliant, right? So the Brides of Strahd are excellent sub bosses, mini bosses that your characters can face, and you can adapt them in your storyline so that they become important checkpoints in your story when you're storming the castle, when you're crashing the wedding. Now, how about taking a look at this one? So, in Curse of Strahd does not only have three brides. He has a fourth bride, Asher. And Asher and if you want to put that in as well, so you could have one more mini boss in that sense in your run of Attack on Castle, Attack on Castle Ravenloft, or the wedding crashing. So it's great. And where would you possibly place these characters? Some of them might be among the guests. If you arrive at the castle, if you're going there in a conventional way with your wedding invitation in hand, if you're gonna worm your way into the castle by mingling with the guests, hopefully not becoming prey in the process, you might see them among the dancers, among the celebrants, among the rest of the wedding party. But if you were to run decidedly a more combative style, or a more investigation style kind of story, you might have them at important checkpoints, important rooms throughout the castle. And they might be holding on to precious artifacts or precious items that would be invaluable in helping the players to succeed. So this is one of those things that you can explore. And you definitely want to create as much variety in the encounters as possible. And we'll talk a little bit about encounter design for this particular run as we go along. Wow, that was quite a bit of a mouthful. I'm gonna just get a bit of tea. So we do that, and yeah. So Do you think this makes a great Rahadin? I think he certainly looks the part. So this is the Cemetery Gatekeeper, also in the set. And Cemetery Gatekeeper, it's a great card in the set for Crimson Vow. I really love the art. I really love how he looks. He really strikes me very much as a Rahadin style character. So in Innistrad, especially if you want to have someone like someone that fits the part, and Rahadin is an excellent major dome style character, right? So he's kind of great for that. And if you ever decide to have the players encounter him, I think that this is gonna be a good stat block to use if you want to represent one of the maybe a gatekeeper major dome style character in your run when you're crushing the wedding for Edgar and Olivia as well. So this kind of fits. Of course, I know that there were some changes that we made when we were running Attack on Castle Ravenloft, and I remember that Rahadin's stat block, which is a custom stat block that appears in the hardcover book for Chris Strad, we swapped it out for a Drow Shadowblade. So that poses a slightly bigger challenge for the players, but it also creates a bit more opportunity for the players to shine as well. Drow Shadowblade is a pretty strong contender, and it's a very viable stat block that you can use to replace Rahadin and to use in your when you're designing a story that's similar, that's kind of inspired by Castle Ravenloft. So then, of course, there's Cyrus Bellevue. Cyrus Bellevue is a viable choice. One of the NPCs that you might face if you were heading down into the basement. It's a mongrel folk in the story, but there are so many odious witches all around in Innistrad that you might encounter some of them in the bowels of Stancy. They might be servants. They might be some sort of maybe indentured slave or something. It might be viable for the story. So you could get it to work. That could really be helpful as part of the storyline. So you could definitely figure that, put that in, and use that to help you to enhance your story. Hey there, what's up? Good to have you with us. We're just chatting about how we can adapt, chapter 4 of Chris Strad, so that we could work that into the storyline for Crimson Vow, so that we can get a bit of wedding crashing going. How do you feel about crashing a vampire wedding? I think generally a lot of the NPCs that we've talked about so far, these are all significant NPCs in the story, and if you are gonna have your characters come up to the castle, you have them break into the castle, you definitely want them to encounter some of these NPCs, and they'll definitely be a good way of pulling into the story a little better. Kind of a death wish. Yeah, I suppose you're right. No, if you are gonna be creeping your way into the castle, if you want to crash the wedding for Olivia and Edgar, and you were pretending to be dead, you might be able to fit yourself into a hearse. I hear that they're using that for their honeymoon. And vampires, they sleep in coffins all the time, right? It's practically part of the trope. In fact, it's not. It's probably not a bad idea. Of course, let's not forget that we're gonna populate the place with undead, all sorts of undead. So we can have all sorts of creatures and the blood servitors, which are also really, really fun card that was printed for Crimson Vow. And look at the artwork. It looks glorious, doesn't it? This creature composed of blood. It's kind of like a blood golem. Personally, I would say I might use a slithering tracker stat block to represent this blood servitor, because it's kind of got an oozy vibe going in that sense. So something a little bit more liquid, a little bit more oozy, seems to be about right to represent the blood servitor. And maybe, I guess, some sort of, if there was something a little bit more powerful, something a little bit higher tier, a little bit higher up, I might consider using maybe an Ooze Master. I don't know. That's entirely possible. It kind of feels the part. So another thing that I was thinking about when I was inspired by looking at the cards was the repository scarab. So this only reminds me of the Cadaver Collector, which is also one of my favorite, creatures in D&D. Especially since it's got that cage on the back, right? So this repository scarab has a cage in the back that looks like it has some spirits in there, and it kind of really reminds me of the Cadaver Collector and the abilities that they have. So it feels really like a good fit. And again, the Cadaver Collector is probably a very thematically appropriate choice to put into such a story. So we could definitely fit it somewhere inside the castle. Perhaps in the basement, where we would probably expect it to be. So this is maybe a good choice as well for that. So since we're talking a little bit about how we're going to populate the castle first, before we start discussing how we're going to plan the route, how we're going to plan the adventure hook for the players, how we're going to be, structuring the encounter design, right? So Cadaver Collector is something definitely on the list. We're definitely going to be looking at this as one of the many creatures that the players might encounter. And who can forget shadows? Lots and lots of shadows. Just like the guys that populate Innistrad. In the castle, we can probably expect some shadows to be around, especially since in Castle Ravenloft, and it's also one of the abilities that Strahd has as well, right? He can animate the shadows of the characters and have the shadows harass the characters. So this is one of the fun little abilities that we could utilize to make the adventure a little bit more exciting for players, to create a bit more of a more targeted encounter. Spirits are definitely a major theme, yeah, for sure. And sometimes the spirits are those of the victims of any of the other supernatural creatures of the night, and they may be helpful as well. So rather than just hindering the characters, the characters might encounter one or two helpful spirits in the castle as well. Who knows? They might be able to form an alliance with one or two of these spirits, and they might be able to tap on their supernatural abilities to help them to win the day. So that's entirely possible as well. And as I was saying, gate crashing, got to hear it as well. So this is where we start talking about building the adventure. Yes, definitely social encounters. Social encounters is a great way. After all, they are supposed to be approaching the wedding because they have an invitation. Right? They've picked one out. So perhaps when we start building the adventure. We start building the story before we start having them prepare to invade the castle. How are we gonna set this up? So we've already established a couple of things, right? So first of all, we kind of know what kind of creatures we're gonna populate the castle with. We know that we are gonna be using the chapter 4 of the Curse of Strahd hardcover as the primary template to create the maps and the encounter design, as well as a rough, I suppose, a rough layout of the castle. So that's gonna be what we're gonna be relying on. And it's entirely, yeah, you could definitely consider coming in as if you were a dignitary. Yeah, you could maybe dress yourself up as a pretend vampire. It could be from one of the more remote bloodlines, perhaps, or you could be a representative from, say, among the people of. I'm trying to remember the name of the other towns. I guess probably not from Gavany, because Gavany was a primarily white town of humans. Uh, you could maybe be a scab engineer. You could be one of those mad scientist types, right? And you could hear maybe with an entourage of zombies. Or you could be here as a distant visitor from some other township. That's entirely possible. Or you could be one of the invited vampires, using some sort of magic to disguise yourself. You could maybe, if you were powerful enough, if you were high leveled enough, that you could cast some means of foiling detection magic. Then you could definitely pretend to be a vampire. You could use spells to disguise yourself. You could use costumes, deception checks. That's entirely possible. Or you could be, I don't know, emergency food. After all, sometimes where vampires and parties are concerned, sometimes the party guests become food, right? So if we want to go with the social aspect, I guess the first part, the call to action, you know that this is going to be a rather dangerous occurrence in the play. You know that if these two families are united in unholy matrimony, bad stuff happens. So your characters are probably pulled into this mission where they have to somehow infiltrate the wedding. They have to find a way in, whether it's through deceit, diplomacy, or direct violence. They have to find a way in and somehow stop this wedding from happening, right? So if we want to go with the main, more social route, I suppose the players could definitely use the invitation to prove their identities, dress up, act the part. After all, vampires are not going to go around with their fangs bared all the time. And with under the right kind of circumstances, the right sort of magic, the right sort of disguises, they could probably make their way past the wedding security. And where the wedding security is concerned, we're gonna just make the vampire spawn. So this could be scene 1, perhaps. Or if you want to have something a little bit more exciting at the start, you could have them perhaps hijack one of the coaches that some vampire nobility is riding in, right? So they could hijack one of these hearses here, and then they could make their way pretending to be the original occupants, of course having dusted the previous occupants already. So that's entirely possible. Make their way past security. That's scene 1. How will we do this? Perhaps we'll have a party of, let's say we have a party of maybe 5 adventurers. And their first challenge is, of course, overcoming the initial wedding security. They're going to come to the gates of the castle. They're going to come to the gates of the Voldaran estate. And there, they might get their first opportunity to interact with. Yeah, they could have their first opportunity to interact with the major domo. That's entirely possible as well. And if they were from a lowly house trying to jostle for more prestige, yeah, that's entirely possible. That's very likely. I don't see why not. So as it were, they'll definitely have to make some social checks, I suppose, role play their way, navigate the social minefields that is vampire nobility, interact with some of the guests. So as they pass through the main gates, they get their security checks, they get their invites looked at, they meet the major domo flags them in if they're successful, and along the way there might be little bits of complications, like perhaps one of them has their clothes in disarray, so they don't quite look like they fit in, or if maybe one of them uh, loses a fang, maybe one of the fake fangs that they put on uh, doesn't quite hold up to scrutiny. That's very very much possible, and they'll have to find ways to circumnavigate this while they're mingling with nobility as well. And along the way, they can probably also try to shape opinion. They could try to identify which parties in the wedding, which guests in the wedding are for the wedding, or which ones are not so keen, and maybe find out if there are possible allies mingled in among the party guests. Maybe they are not the only group that's there to try to crash the wedding. So if maybe there are some werewolves mixed in with the lot, or there might be some vampire slayers mixed in with the lot as well, and they could try to connect with those, and that could make for a very nice, hour-long social encounter. So that's going to be a lot of effort on the part of the game master, right, of the DM, to roleplay all these NPCs out. But it's entirely possible, as long as you put in some effort, some time to write down some social interactions for the players to work with. That's perfectly possible. So like in Crimson Vow, you have Sorin and some of the other planeswalkers who are planning to crash the wedding. It's entirely possible that the players, if they were not in the same party, they could probably encounter these other planeswalkers as NPCs, and you could work that into the story as well. And then they will have some powerful help, whereas when they need it, especially later on when they are contending with tougher encounters. So that's part one. Another way to approach this is if the party decides that they don't want to go with social approach, what happens? What if they want to crash the wedding in a more direct way? So it's entirely possible that they might want to drive the hearse right into the gates, make sure that the hearse is loaded up with all sorts of explosives, and then set off a pretty big chain reaction, get it there with a bang, send all the vampire nobles who are not so warlike, who are a little bit more cowardly, fleeing, and then they mob up. That's entirely possible as well. I think that will make a very exciting, very very action-packed opening for a more combat-focused party. And then you see how much of their resources they're going to spend as they go along throughout the entire course of the adventure. And I think that will also be a great addition. And if you have a party that's maybe a bit more sneaky, maybe they want to do a bit of exploration rather than combat or social pillar. Yeah, they kind of figure it out. And that's one other way as well. They could maybe explore around the grounds, find a way in through the catacombs, or find a way in through one of the side passages, the servants' quarters perhaps, and pick their way up to assassinate the bride or the groom before anything else happens. So this is one way you could develop the story as well. So once you have your premise set up, and you have your players, you can definitely look at what they're good at and suggest several different courses of action. So here we have outlined three possible approaches with our call to action. So the call to action is, hey, we don't want these vampires getting married because it's going to be bad for the plane. Everyone's going to be prey to the vampires. They're going to take over, and as adventurers, you're here to thwart them. So that's what you're supposed to do. And then you have three possible approaches. You could go with the social route to try to work your way in using subterfuge, diplomacy, some disguises perhaps, or you could crash the wedding in a more literal fashion by blowing up the gate with a wagon that you have hijacked perhaps, and sending most of the guests fleeing and then mopping up after. Or you could explore the grounds and find a way to infiltrate and perhaps do a more subtle assassination. So that's entirely three approaches right there. Now, we're going to talk a little bit, I suppose, about what we can do with the next portion after you get in. What's going to happen next? After you get in, if you rile up the entire party of vampires, the majority of them will probably be vampire spawn. I don't think we would be using all too many full-blooded vampires, even if it's a vampire party kind of thing, right? Where there are a lot of noble vampires. Most of them are probably going to be spawn. Most of them are probably going to be lower level vampires, simply because you don't want to overwhelm the players too much as well. And the vast majority of the rank and file vampire spawn are probably going to be the ones that are going to be in the security detail. They might be guards. While the full-blooded vampires are probably going to be the named villains, the named vampires, that your characters will be facing in certain places, in certain parts of the castle. So that's going to be a little different. And of course, not to mention that there are all sorts of other supernatural creatures that could populate the place as well that you could bring to the fore and you could utilize. So that's going to be where we're going to come in now, and we're going to start planning the routes. So if you're going to do the social part, what's going to happen after the socials? After the first portion, when you determine who's for and who's against the wedding, what happens next? Of course, there's going to be a party. The party usually has an itinerary. So if we're going to create a more social-based experience for the players, perhaps this takes place in the foyer and the grand halls of the castle, right? And then they may go to the dining room, or there might be a large dining area. There might be a dance floor where people are going to be mingling. And if you have an itinerary drawn up for such an activity, so because this is a more social party style kind of approach, you will want to have a timetable. So perhaps every character's actions might take up a certain block of time. And when the clock hits a certain block of time, something happens, something predetermined, something scripted happens. So say maybe when they arrive at the stroke of midnight, that's when the party begins, perhaps. And people start getting served, goblets of wine. There are some delectable desserts by way of human refugees who were kidnapped and are turned into blood bags for your enjoyment. People are mingling, and then maybe at 1:30 on the clock, something happens. Maybe they caught a bunch of adventurers trying to sneak in, and these adventurers are paraded into the dining hall, and they're forced to fight for sport, to fight for entertainment. Yeah, vampires are totally scary, and people are totally called bloodbags by vampires. I can guarantee you. You're kind of like emergency rations, I suppose. A vampire mom asks, "Why are you back so late?" I don't know. Or why are you back so early? Yes, I suppose that makes more sense. After all, the clock's kind of reversed for vampires, right? They're nocturnal creatures. So yeah, if you have some encounters scripted and set up for the social portion, it can be really interesting as well. Like maybe there's a bit of maybe with these adventurers who were arrested, were caught by the security trying to sneak in. The fact that these adventurers were not so good, they were not so effective, and they were caught, they might end up implicating your party, especially if you had come in pretending to be vampires, and they can instantly tell that, hey, you're that other group of hunters, but you're successful in sneaking in, but they were not so much. So you might end up being implicated by them, or there might be a complication where you must find a way to help them survive so that they can continue their side of the mission, where maybe they're here to plant some, maybe plant some alchemical explosive somewhere, right? Or disrupt some sort of plan, maybe pour some garlic extract into the soup or something. So that's entirely possible. Or you might also get caught, and then you're forced to fight this other group of adventurers to the death. For sport and for entertainment for the guests who are all gathered here in this wonderful place for the wedding of Edgar and Olivia. It's entirely viable as a story development as well. For me, I'll definitely pick the most dramatic development to challenge the players. And if it means forcing them to make a tough moral decision, tough choice right here, where they have to determine the fate of the other party of adventurers that were caught, that's even better. Yeah, fighting for sport is definitely something that vampires would see, right? They would love to enjoy the spectacle of it. And when the blood flows, when people get cut and the blood sprays everywhere, the vampires are just gonna delight in it. They're gonna find that it's one of those, lovely things that they do for entertainment. And yeah, that's entirely possible. They could wake up in a dungeon. It's very likely as well if they were caught, if they were, average members of the peasantry, if they were adventurers who were somehow knocked out and kidnapped by vampires. They could appear in the dungeon and they might be given a good scrubbing by some of the odious witches that maybe run the dungeon, and then told to put on their most elegant, most presentable outfits, paraded up into the front hall. They might get a bit lost, you don't know, and or you might not be sure what's entirely going on. And this is actually a good hook for tier 1 characters, where you're maybe pretty low leveled and you're thrust into this situation where you are completely and woefully unprepared for, and you're dragged out there, placed in this ballroom, given weapons, and told to fight for the amusement and entertainment of the vampires. And the vampires might say, hey, if you fight well, perhaps I'll give you the gift of immortality as well. Right? So you might be bestowed with the vampiric gift, or vampiric curse, as it were, in return for providing good entertainment. Or you might be told, fight to the last man standing. And how does the party fight their way out of this? How do they work their way out of this disastrous situation? That's a great start for a story as well. Yeah, that's entirely possible. They might be, pulling your leg, as it were. It's entirely likely that they'll give you false hope by telling you, hey, fight for your own survival. And after that, when you've got all the adrenaline pumping, when you've got all your blood pumping, the vampires are gonna just swoop down all on you, and they're just gonna nom you and eat you up. That's entirely likely as well, because vampires, right, can never be trusted. Or they'll sooner lie to you and with a straight face. After all, they have pretty good deception checks, I believe. So that's entirely likely as well. Why not? It's a great choice. Or perhaps if we were going to follow this scenario, what happens if your party was the one that blew up the gates? Perhaps when you blew up the gates, you disrupted such a situation happening on the inside. So maybe some battle for sport was happening in the dining hall. The vampires are bored, they're hanging around, they're watching the spectacle, or sipping their drinks, just like, all those pretentious people at art galleries sipping their wine and just watching and trying to look very educated and smart and smug, right? So when that's happening, your caravan with the explosives crashes into the front door. There is an explosion. Some werewolves got a bit sick on them as well. Maybe they were, maybe they jumped through the windows, crashing through the windows, smashing the windows, or swung in from the chandeliers or something. That would have been a great disruption for the party. And then your players would use this opportunity to move quickly through the castle to head towards where maybe Olivia and Edgar are and try to assassinate one of them. So that's very, very likely, very viable. Or if you were sneaking when you approach. So again, remember I said there were three possible approaches we could use for this. So now this is the second part for the sneaky approach. You hear the commotion upstairs. There's an explosion. You know for a fact that they had just marched the prisoners from down below up to the main hall not too long ago. And talking about those Innistrad short stories, definitely check them out. It's the Magic Story column on the official Wizards of the Coast Magic the Gathering website, and they are excellent stories. Please go read those stories. So they're very, very flavorful, very well written. There's a good, healthy amount of art that goes with the stories as well, and they all really tie in with the way that the planes are set up, the way that the concepts for each of these planes, the way for each of these sets are designed as well. So it's brilliant. So that's definitely a good suggestion right there. More reading material for any fan of Magic the Gathering. And Crimson Vow is great for vampires in general. So if you love vampire stories, check them out. All right, so sneaky approach. How would we do this? If you had just gone into the basement, commotions going up above, guards start flooding into the basement where you're trying to make your way through. How would you do this? How would you find a way to blend in and continue to be sneaky? Maybe if you could get a jump on a group of guards. Maybe some of these vampire guards, this wedding security, maybe you could just grab a hold of them while they're otherwise distracted, and then you could steal their garb, steal their garments, steal their uniforms, and maybe smear a bit of blood in your faces, and then very possibly, work your way through the crowds while pretending to be security. That could definitely get you into places that you might otherwise not be able to get into if you were just a rank and file guest. Right? So that's entirely possible as an approach for the sneaky. What do you think? So we talked about the honeymoon hairs and gate crashing and stuff happening, and of course the assault, which is just what we're talking about, right? The gates being blown up, people jumping in through the windows. So this is the Resistance Squad, another card from the set. Yeah, Tovalar is a great card. Excellent card. Lets you draw more cards as well. It's a lovely card in the Midnight Hunt set. And Arlen Cord, the new Arlen is insanely good as well. I totally agree. Incredibly strong. And of course, I believe that there was a new one that was printed in the recent set as well. Everbrook something or the other that gives all your werewolves hexproof. That is disgusting. Super disgusting card. how long is the stream lasting until? I think we're gonna go pretty long today. We're just gonna keep talking a little bit about how to develop the story as we go, and um, maybe till about 10:30 ish, I guess. So we're just taking it pretty casual today, and it's really about how we're trying to figure out how we can tell the story for Crimson Vow, turning into an adventure, building along that, and perhaps I might even run this once we're all set, once we've got all the scenes set up, and we can play through these scenes. Seems like it's going to be pretty fun to try, especially if there are three different possible scenarios. So if we're gonna do this, it's gonna not be too long, rather than using the entirety of Castle Ravenloft, right? So if we have to set up with the castle itself as forming the groundwork for us as a base of the adventure, uh, we're definitely not going to be going through every single room. We're going to pick our rooms that we want people to play in. We're going to pick the rooms where the characters might encounter NPCs that they can face. They might be able to fight them, or they might be able to convince them. So that's going to be the thing. So one of the places that I think we'll definitely want to explore, and I really like the idea of using this room in particular, is the crypts. So the crypts in Castle Ravenloft seem like a great place for you to have lots and lots of vampires, for where you can have all the players, venturing cautiously through the underground crypts before they get to the place where maybe they've got Edgar Markov's coffin sealed away, right? Or like they might have decided to put him in a new coffin or something over here, and they might have kept him like captive in the coffin. So that's entirely possible. Or if you were thinking about maybe a place where the nuptial chambers for Edgar and Olivia. So that's entirely possible for as a great place that the characters can try to locate. So thinking about that, we could definitely build towards that. And of course, the finale, when we come towards so we're gonna talk about, say, maybe one or two encounters in between. So if we're gonna build something to follow up with the social encounter, so from the social encounter we get to the possibility of them, doing a spectator sport, trying to work their way through, and then perhaps finding out information about where the bride is getting her hair done, where she's dressing up for the grand affair, where's the waiting room. Perhaps you want to go assassinate Olivia. So that's one of the routes that you could take. So how are you going to do that? Perhaps you want to intercept some of the maids in waiting, some of the ladies in waiting that are helping in the preparations. Or your characters may try to find more information from some of the staff. So that's more social activities right there. So you can explore, and then maybe do a bit of deception checks, a bit more, persuasion checks there as well, before you finally head to confront some of the NPCs that you're supposed to deal with. And then along the way, there might be complications. You might realize that in some of the side rooms, there are side quests, right? You might discover that some adventurers, other than yourselves, rather than being held captive, they might have fallen in with the vampires. They might be the ones that have betrayed your plans to the vampires, and the vampires are actively looking out for you. So that's very, very viable as well. That's a good way of building up on your story. So you're definitely developing the story as you go along. Maybe there's some sort of there might be a bit of deviation or two from how the original idea came to be, right? So your original idea was, hey, we're gonna just go crash the wedding. But already here, we're coming up with so many different branches, so many different alternative encounters that the players might face. Or perhaps you might be in the basement and all of a sudden you encounter a a great arcane device in the basement. And this arcane device is guarded by some, some scabs, some of those cadaver collectors stat blocks. And that's entirely possible as one of the potential combat encounters in the basement. So building up along those lines before we come to the grand finale. And then, of course, what happens when you come to the finale itself? It's not gonna be just as simple as catching the NPCs in the act of preparing themselves and they're completely surprised and you just get to jump on them. There's something that happen, right? Maybe so one of the things that I would say will become a set piece for the adventure, in fact, is probably culminating in a battle where your characters must confront the bride and the groom. So if you were to battle, say maybe Edgar and Olivia, so that's going to be using the Strad Vanzarovich stat block and perhaps a vampire spellcaster stat block. So it's going to be two of them. How's your party going to handle that? And where can we hold this final grand dramatic affair? In most circumstances, you would imagine that such an affair would take place on the rooftops at the top of a grand tower somewhere in the castle. But that's entirely possible. You could do that. I don't see why not. Or you could have it take place all in the ballroom, so everything comes back to the ballroom, where there's a great spectacle where everyone is all around watching. Because this is, after all, a battle for dominance. And there is no greater way for them to cement their dominance than to make an example out of these upstart adventurers that have tried to crash the wedding, right? So that's entirely viable for them to do as well. So they could do that in the large, banquet area or even in the dining area. So that's one of the ways you could do that. So how will we go about setting that up? Maybe there's some obstacles in the way. I would love to see the entire set for the dining area being created. So you have nice, ornate, rich and red burgundy curtains, drapes and in velvet. You have those long banquet tables. You have blood fountains, and you have champagne glasses full of blood, right, stacked up nicely in several tiers. So as you come into this place, you can see it's very ostentatious, it's very pretty, it's very elegant, rose petals scattered everywhere, blood, food and drink, all sorts of blood in them, people dancing in the sidelines, people standing around chatting in the sidelines and the wings, and then this grand staircase rising from the ground floor, from the ground level of this dining area, all the way up to the second story. And from that second story, from the landing of the second story, that is where the bride and groom are going to come down the stairs. And if your characters, the adventurers, are going to contend with them, you might, I don't know, swing down from the chandeliers from the second story or from the third story. You could slide and rappel down the curtains or the banners from the third story all the way down to the ground floor, and then you brandish your weapons and confront them. that will make for quite a brilliant scene if you're designing that. And of course, all these environmental effects, all these furniture, all the props all around, they could definitely be used to work into the story, into the mechanics of the encounter. I think that will be pretty fun, especially with multiple levels, multiple floors. It's going to benefit not just the players but also the enemies as well. Why? Because vampires can spider climb. Vampires can turn into mist form and just float around, or they can turn into bat form and fly around, right? So multiple layers, multiple levels to fight. We make it very interesting. It'll add a whole layer of three-dimensional combat to it. And this also challenges the players, I suppose, to understand how to utilize their spells. And if the NPCs on the wings, if all the other vampire spawn, all the other full-blooded vampires are forbidden from interfering because of some decorum or because of the commands of the bride and groom, then they might just clear out and create a big enough, circle around the area, circling it with their bodies as they watch and wait, see what happens next. And then perhaps one of the things you can consider adding to that is if your characters have already, throughout the course of the social portions of the adventure, kind of sussed out who is helpful to them and who isn't so helpful to them, this might come back to you as bonuses in this third part of the adventure. So maybe one of the vampire families that is not so fond of, say, the bride and the groom, or the bride or the groom, they might give you a little bit of aid here and there. You might get some inspiration for them. Or they might subtly cast one or two spells your way to help you out. So that's entirely possible as a layer of added complication to the adventure design as well. Or if you had identified some other potential allies and other NPCs who are not vampires, who might have mingled in with the crowd, you might be able to earn their favor or use them to your benefit here as well. So this is one of the other possibilities that you could consider for creating this portion of the adventure. If everything takes place in a ballroom and you were coming back to relying on the social advantages that you had gathered from being successful in your various social encounters. So that will definitely give your characters the edge, because dealing with a vampire and a vampire or the two vampire spellcasters can be a little tough. So, or another way to look at it, another way I think you can look at it is if you were going to go pure into combat. You're going to blow up the doors, you're going to sick the werewolves in the vampire party, you're going to charge up the stairs. Up the stairs, face off a few groups of security, maybe beat down one or two full-blooded vampires. Like I said, maybe they were the Brides of Strahd in that sense. In this case, they are, higher leveled, higher tiered vampires throughout the entire compound, throughout the entire ballroom. So you might face them off in the upper levels as you're heading up towards one of the towers. You beat them down as you climb steadily upwards, and you might eventually come face to face with the bride and the groom in one of the upper areas. But before that, you're gonna have multiple encounters with patrols and full-blooded vampires as you go along, or their minions, or whatever supernatural creatures they can bring to bear. Maybe there's even a coven of witches that work at their behest, a coven of hags. Who knows? That could be entirely viable as well. That could be one of the possible situations that you come to face. And then finally, if you were doing the sneaky and you have managed to disguise yourself effectively as security, you could head up to the bride and the groom and offer to escort them somewhere. Take them away from the castle. and then ambush them when they are out of the earshot and out of sight of their potential allies and helpers. So that could end up in a different portion of the castle, maybe a little more obscure portion, one of the more decrepit areas of the castle that's not often patrolled or not often visited. And there you can face them and take them out before anything else happens. So that's one of the ways that you could do that as well for the more sneaky approach, which would give you a bit more opportunity to let characters that are not normally so combative but are more capable of exploration and skill checks to shine a little bit, because more often than not, it's the rogues and the rangers who are often not given too much opportunity to use their exploration skills or to use their inbuilt abilities, and doing something like this might give them a chance to shine. So that's something that would be really good for them. So yeah, so we have kind of covered quite a bit. So far, we have talked about all three different approaches, how we might create scenarios for each of them, and just using the Castle Ravenloft map guide. So you could use some of the rooms in Castle Ravenloft and use some of the ways that you connect and join with each other to help you to get a good gauge of how the Voltaren estate might look like. And of course, building all those little encounters, creating something thematically appropriate, and stringing it all together, and putting them into a coherent kind of story where your players are offered so many options, whether it's social options, combat options, or exploration options. And this creates an overall a pretty coherent kind of wedding crashing kind of scenario, right? So it's more or less you know what you're there for, and these are all the possible options. These are all the possible things that could happen as the story develops and goes along. And of course, when it comes to the fight itself, remember, if we are using the Strahd stat block as well as the Vampire Spellcaster to represent Olivia, or you could flip it around so that Edgar is using the Vampire Spellcaster and Olivia is using the Strahd stat block. Be sure to utilize all the tricks and tools at your disposal. I wouldn't be surprised if Olivia were capable of using many of the same actions as lair actions as listed in Strahd's stat block. After all, Stancia is her domain and the Voldaren estate is her estate. So I wouldn't imagine otherwise how she would be able to phase through the walls, for example, or to conjure spirits and other creatures from the walls. And I think that these are all very appropriate to the story, and it works with her stat block kinda. So you just need to reflavor some of them to give it a more Magic the Gathering, more Innistrad style kind of vibe. But otherwise, I dare say that the Strahd stat block seems to be a good fit for Olivia, especially since she is such a predominantly powerful vampire and as depicted in the story. So you want to use her to your best ability. Don't be afraid to use all the tricks at your disposal. We talked a little bit just now about strategies using vampires, right? So like making full use of their legendary actions as well as their legendary resistances. And if we were to take a look at the Strahd stat block in particular, Strahd stat block is a little different from a typical vampire spellcaster because Strahd has slightly higher ability scores, slightly higher DC on spells, and Strahd also has a very different, more combat-oriented spell list as opposed to the typical vampire spellcaster. So that would make a great representation for Olivia, especially if you want to play her as a more combative villain who's more daring to use all the abilities at her disposal. So you could lob some fireballs at the party if you want, and that would work great. And as for Edgar, Edgar would be you if you're using the vampire standard vampire spellcaster set block for Edgar, I think it works kind of decently as well. You may want to change out some of Edgar's spells if that were the case, since he seems to be a little bit like in the card for Edgar, he gives a +1/+1. He's an anthem to other vampires. And that might be all, basically translate to buffs, right? So you may want to consider giving him the ability to buff and debuff his allies. So in which case he will be giving buffs and buffs to Olivia and debuffing the players. So that's one thing to think about when it comes to his spell picks for Edgar. And of course, that's gonna be where we are gonna jump into the finale. And as you can see, that's gonna be one of the biggest parts of the story, wrapping it up, having them fight the bride and the groom, and having the players eventually vanquish the bride and the groom. That will make a fitting end to the story. All's well that ends well, right? Of course, I believe that in the story for Innistrad Crimson Vow, you're supposed to bring Grandpa back, but it's gonna be a little different, I imagine. Where it comes to D&D, where D&D is concerned, where the players are involved, and more likely than not, you're gonna want to vanquish. Yeah, or if you let love win, I don't know. I don't think blood bonding someone passes for love. I mean, Edgar is charmed, right? He's called a charmed groom for a reason. So Edgar's awakening was when I believe Olivia fed him some blood from her vein. And and him being charmed and all makes things a little different. I suppose if you let love win, you can always wipe the party. And that'll be the end of it, right? BBT blood, bubble tea blood? I don't know. I mean, bubble tea. Yeah, if you take bubble tea, I guess with the brown sugar and stuff, it's you could definitely try to cure the charm effect. Yeah, if he were charmed or if he were dominated in some way, you could try to dispel the effect if you could find a way to do that. That's entirely viable. You don't have to necessarily kill everything, even though uh, even though players love to kill everything, right? Lots of PCs love killing everything that moves, every NPC that has a stat block. They just get wiped out, and then the players just loot all the treasures and run away. But that's not what we want. Some people can charm people with bubble tea. Well, I mean, bubble tea is definitely a great tribute to offer to the studio, and anyone who knows us kind of knows how we love our bubble tea. So I guess if you wanted to offer tribute, bubble tea would be a suitable tribute, and that could be charming in its own way. I'll give you advantage at the table if you buy bubble tea when running a game. I don't deny that. Unless it's zero sugar bubble tea. Disadvantage. Yeah, bubble tea with zero sugar is not the best. It's just kind of weird tasting. But yeah, I think that's actually a very valid point. Maybe dispelling the charm and letting the players figure out how they could restore everything will work. Yeah, I think that's great. a very big possibility there as well. So if the players actually encounter Olivia first, maybe they catch her by surprise and they realize that they're completely overwhelmed because she is a very powerful character. And if you're giving her the Stradivasarovich stat block, she's definitely going to be very powerful. She's going to be able to bring all the legendary actions and their actions to bear. And perhaps because of some other story considerations as well, you might even want to introduce some of the special resistances and immunities that are granted by the heart in the basement of Strahd's castle, right? So that might be one of the things that you could bring in as a story point as well to make her even harder to defeat. And definitely, if you were going to play towards that, you may need to get Edgar's assistance with that, or perhaps assistance of the other planeswalkers who might have somehow sneaked their way into the wedding as well. So that could create another layer to the story that you could develop and work with to enhance the experience for the players, and to create a more unified kind of storytelling. It's a kind of unified concept. Personally, I would say that at the same time, I would probably try to populate the castle or the wedding with items that might be beneficial to the players. So kind of like party favors. And if you want to kind of do something using the existing seeds, the existing items that are available in Castle Ravenloft, since we are basing this off Castle Ravenloft anyway, you could place some of these items in some of the adjoining rooms, like perhaps one of the powerful items that you might find in the castle, like the like the Luckblade sword, right? That's one of the popular items that's found in Castle Ravenloft. So you might have a magic sword somewhere in the castle. And that could be very helpful to the players, especially if they had to have their items checked in at the door. Because if you're going to a party, you probably don't think it's going to be likely that players will be allowed to bring in weapons and armor. You're there to look the part, but you're not there to be dressed to kill, unless you're Chandra. So it's going to be a little different. So maybe having those items around in the castle for the players to discover as well could help them along in their, in their struggles, in their adventure. And eventually those items may come in handy, especially when you're fighting with Olivia and so on and so forth, right? So that's another layer to the story that we could add as well, where they have to actually retrieve their items, or perhaps use the items that they snatch from the guards or from the armory in the castle, or from the treasury in the castle, perhaps. So that's definitely another way of adding to the story. Yeah, like kind of like a heist movie, I suppose you're kind of right in that sense. But at the same time, all these items will be seeded in certain places. So the players, if they're able to make their way through the castle and they're kind of able to explore a little bit without raising the alarm too much. So maybe we can create something like a table. So I kind of like some of these tables or checklists, right? So we can create a checklist for the adventure as well. So if we were ever to design something like this, maybe a checklist of things, of do's and do nots. After all, and there might be some taboos in weddings, or there might be things that they do that might be tricky, that may raise the alarm, or they might raise the level of the alarm. Go up by the toilet. So what you're saying is about adventurers sneaking in through the toilet. No, I don't think the undead use the toilet either. So that might give the game away if the characters try to sneak off to the toilet. It would probably alert the guards unless they were able to somehow disguise their attempt, or they could drag a cult, maybe a captive, but someone pretending to be a captive could be dragged with them. So it could look like a vampire bringing their blood bag off somewhere just to get a bit of a bite. So that's possible. Maybe they're just shy. They don't want to drink in public. But yeah, so that's an added complication. Tables with do's and do nots. If you if you draw attention to yourself too much, then maybe check something off. You raise the level of the alarm or the alert level will go up, and there might be more guards or things might have some disadvantage on certain checks. Like you might get disadvantage on deception checks because the guards are now more alert, they're more careful, and they're more observant. They try to scrutinize people moving around the party a little more closely. Or perhaps the players had caused a bit of a commotion before and they were spotted causing the commotion. So the guards are tipped off that there are some suspicious people around. And by comparison, if they were able to divert the attention to some other groups, perhaps some other NPCs were in the area, then alert level might go down because guards will become more uh, the guards will become more overconfident because they think, hey, we've gotten rid of the problem. We have beaten up these other group of adventurers who thought that they could sneak in, and we've killed them and we've turned their blood into pudding. Then their attention may perhaps be, I guess, diverted from the players. So that's one way to do that. But whatever the case is, I think we've chatted quite a bit about how to develop this, wedding crashing scenario, and how to kind of design the story, kind of design some of the encounters that might be possible in the story. Oh, well, I mean, was this helpful? This is just kind of how I work when it comes to designing adventures. A lot of it's talking through the inspiration, talking through some of the ideas, and just sounding it out, looking back at it, looking at some of the material that we have from the Crimson Vow set, looking at some of the artwork, looking at some of the creatures, characters that might appear, mapping them to D&D, and figuring out where everything fits together. I'm definitely kind of excited to see where we can go with this. I'll definitely be putting up some notes based on today's DM inspiration segment onto our social media channels. So other than the VOD for this, which will go up on our YouTube in a couple of weeks, we'll probably also put together some notes, and it's going to go up on the Neo Tokyo Project blog, and I'll maybe do one or two sample encounters and post it there as well. So hopefully that will give everyone who's kind of interested to run a wedding crashing scenario involving vampires as villains, and maybe give you some ideas and give you some hopefully some inspiration to help you to run a better adventure based on that as well. So yeah, honestly, I just can't wait to see more of the magic story for Crimson Dawn, and to see where they're actually going with the story as well. I believe that as of yesterday there were 3 chapters on the website, and especially since the set is coming out. In fact, the set street date I believe is 19th of November, so that's it. Sometime during this week, and when that happens, I'm definitely gonna be opening more packs, I think. So let's see what else we can get. So is anybody else excited about Crimson Dawn? Vampires in general, I think they're pretty exciting. And we did cover quite a bit today about vampires, and I hope that this was a fairly good indication of what you might be able to see in the packs as well. Look at the artwork. I mean, we've shown quite a few pieces of art from there. Yeah, even if you don't play, I know your luck is really good. Most of the time, you're the one who opens a ridiculous number of rares and really valuable cards. So I guess if you want to open packs, you totally can. And of course, for us, I think that we are gonna be also putting out some articles about building an EDH deck involving some of the cards from Crimson Dawn. So that's gonna also go up on the Neo Tokyo Project blog. And if we are so inclined, because I know that we are going to be seeing a lot more Magic the Gathering content in the future, as well as for Strixhaven, because Strixhaven is going to be the next book that's going to be released now that Fistband is out. Strixhaven is the next big thing for Magic the Gathering and D&D. There's going to be a bit of crossover, and Adventurers League has mentioned that there is going to be a self-contained alternate campaign kind of story for Strixhaven. So I'm definitely looking forward to that, and I'm hoping that there will be some opportunity for us to actually play those adventures, and maybe we will even stream some of those adventures. So yeah, so that's the I think that's more or less, what we have for tonight uh in our discussion on DM inspiration. And yes, definitely people actually like colleges. I think that that's gonna be really fun because it's kind of like going back to school, magic school kind of thing. A lot of people are probably gonna be wanting to relive their, I guess, their school days, but with magic, and that's really, really exciting. Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. Uh, I'm also quite curious about what they're going to do with Kamigawa as well as the new Neon Dynasty, because that is looking really cool, really solid. Mm-hmm. I that's definitely true. Yeah, Ravnica was one of the greatest planes ever designed, and there's a lot of excited people who are still kind of playing, Magic the Gathering, D&D crossover kind of games. And in fact, when they released Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, they published several D&D adventures to go with that as well. And those adventures are pretty decent. It creates a good body of lore for that. Color identity and themed schools and guilds, yes, definitely. And for a lot of players, I think that picking the right kind of school or guild, that best reflects their personality is something pretty interesting. Like, even for us, when we build our commander decks, right? We usually try to build decks that are kind of reflective of our personalities, I suppose. Like, like me building a Laurel because I'm a very, uh, I guess I'm a very, I'm a player that doesn't like to allow other people to play, from what I've been told. Yeah, is it just actually pretty good, even in standard right now. So that's actually quite fascinating. And wow, we've kind of deviated from talking about, D&D and vampires to talking about magic. But magic's also one of the really critical things that we talk about most of the time as well. And in fact, I think we might be approaching a little bit more magic-oriented D&D material in the weeks to come, especially if we get more inspiration. So it's really one of the things that we might be writing more of or chatting more of as and when we go along. In fact, I think that if we were to if we were to keep going on and on and on about all these about D&D and Magic and all the hobbies we like, we'll probably go beyond 10:30. We'll probably end up chatting till 11 or even 12, and I definitely need more tea. Aloro sit down and control the game. Suits me well. I suppose, though I've been trying really hard to be a bit more proactive in my plays. Yeah, everyone's definitely waiting for in-person games. We want to see that happen perhaps in the near future. We don't know. I mean, hopefully, fingers crossed. Yeah, fingers crossed. Let's see what happens. Fingers crossed. Hopefully things kind of work out and the restrictions get a little better, and then we can all have in-person games of D&D and in-person games of Magic again. If you fall asleep, we skip your turn. Yes, that's not exactly great. What if he falls asleep on Twitch? Mm, not quite. I would like to think that I'm pretty alert on Twitch. You're gonna hit me with D20? No, please don't hit me with D20. I totally don't want to be hit with a D20. Sleep streams are a thing. Yeah, I guess they kind of are. Pay bits to hit. Would you pay bits to hit me with D20? Okay, Derek Howe has used 1 bit to cheer. Okay, well, that's not very reassuring, is it? But yeah, honestly, if I don't know if that's a thing, but hitting me with D20 is probably not a good idea. Look at me side-eyeing the D20. Yeah. No. Should watch out next week. See, I guess I should wear a sturdier hat next week instead of this Dodoko hat. I should probably wear something a little bit more sturdy next week, just in case. D20 is probably not so good. Actually, so talking about D20s, actually we have a soft toy D20. So that's the one that Jazian is talking about using, I think. Yeah, this one. If it were something a little bit more solid, I don't think that would be a good idea. Not at all. Yeah. Genshin plushie. I don't think I want to be hit by this slime. That'll be pretty nasty. Cryo slime. Talking about cryo slimes, I should. I'm kind of glad to say that we also have a cryo slime hat. And if you ever want to see Jazian wearing the cryo slime hat, um, yeah, some bits, or if we hit enough follows or if we hit enough subs, there's gonna be more fun stuff. I guess it's not just gonna be hats. We'll think about weird stuff like costumes maybe. I know we were talking about it several streams ago. So yeah, I mean we were all cosplayers before, so I don't think we'll be quite that embarrassed stream. I mean, I remember that one time when Jazian was wearing the saber lion costume. So, so yeah, I don't think anything kind of embarrasses us anymore. But hey, Lion of Komari, hello. First time chat, so glad to have you with us. You just joined us at the tail end of our stream. But not to worry. I mean, if you we are in fact about to wrap it up. You're right. It's about 10:30, so we are kind of done for today's stream. But nonetheless, you can definitely check out the VOD. We had quite a bit of a discussion today about running vampires for D&D as villains, talking a little bit about strategies for vampires, how you could run a vampire spellcaster, and also how we could use Curse of Strahd, Chapter 4, the castle, as a setting for if we were ever to create something based off the wedding crashing scenario for Magic the Gathering's Crimson Vow set, which is a new set that they have that's based in Innistrad, and it's full of vampires as well. So hope everyone had a great time listening and chatting. I know we have a lot more things lined up for the rest of the week as well. So be sure to come check us out on Wednesday. We're gonna have our game stream on Wednesday. Oh hey, okay, you know what? Just for you, let's chat a little bit more of this. Psychic Energy Dampier. So that is pretty cool. How do you envision building this character? Are you gonna be using the Dampier race as your core race, and are you gonna build with a maybe a psychic warrior or a soul knife? Because that kind of fits, I think. Seems like a pretty interesting combination. I think that kind of works very nicely because all the abilities seem to synergize with each other. Or if you wanted to maybe add a bit of, a bit more solid magic to that, you could probably use an Aberrant Mind as part of the build as well. Building with Wizard. Ah, that is such an unusual choice, but it's also very, very cool. So I'm really glad to know that you're building an interesting character, and that's really great for us. It's great sharing. Thank you for sharing. Wow. I mean, definitely, if you have the chance to, you can definitely catch out, our VOD, and that's gonna be here on Twitch, and also gonna be posted on YouTube maybe a couple of weeks from now as well. And you can recap on what we have covered about vampires, as well as running, yeah, Crimson Vow, inspired adventure for D&D. So thank you everyone for hanging out with me today and for chatting and for sharing about your characters or some of your ideas and how it helped me build up in the story as well. And I hope that this was as inspiring as for you as it was for me. So thank you all for joining me, and this is Crimson signing off.